At first, it seemed like a normal fire in the house of a lonely old woman. But when the firefighters looked inside, they did something no one expected. They let the house burn to the ground. Subscribe and write where you're watching this video from. Martha had lived in the same house for nearly half a century, and for much of that time it had been a place filled with warmth, laughter, and the small joys that come with family life. The little wooden structure sat on the edge of town, away from the busier roads and shops, and for years it had been a beacon of welcome to anyone who passed by. The porch, once adorned with hanging flower baskets and a wooden swing, had been her favorite place to sit in the evenings beside her husband. The yard had once been neatly trimmed, the flower beds bursting with color and the vegetable garden carefully tended. Children played on the grass, grandchildren ran through sprinklers in the summer, and neighbors often stopped by to chat over sweet tea. That had been Martha's world, and for many years it seemed unshakable. Time, however, has a way of altering even the most steadfast of lives. The house, like its owner, began to show signs of age. First came the peeling paint along the shutters, then the roof that leaked in heavy rainstorms, and later the sagging porch steps that groaned underfoot. Martha noticed these things, but told herself she would get around to them. Her husband used to fix everything with his own 2 hands. But after his death, the tools in the shed remained untouched. The longer she left the repairs undone, the harder they became to face. Martha was in her early 70s now, her hair silver gray and her movements slower than before. She was still polite to everyone she met, still offered a smile and a kind word, but there was a heaviness in her eyes that others could not help but notice. Her children had long since moved away to different cities, caught up in their own families and responsibilities, and visits were rare. Letters arrived less frequently. Phone calls were polite but hurried, and gradually Martha slipped into a routine of solitude. At first, she had tried to keep the house as it had always been, watering the garden, dusting the furniture, and cooking as though someone might still walk through the door hungry for supper. But, as months stretched into years, her energy waned, and the house began to slip into disarray. Weeds sprouted where flowers once grew, vines crept up the walls, and the once bright curtains inside dulled beneath layers of dust. To the neighbors, it looked like neglect. To Martha, it was the slow unraveling of a world she no longer had the strength to hold together. The most curious thing, however, was that Martha no longer seemed to live inside the house at all. Those who passed by in the evenings noticed the faint outline of her figure sitting in her old car parked in the driveway. It was an aging Buick with faded paint and worn seats, yet night after night there she would be, curled up beneath a blanket, her head resting against the window. Sometimes she left the car door slightly open for air, and the sound of crickets and cicadas filled the night around her. Other times she pulled the blanket tightly, as though shutting herself off from the world. Even in winter, when frost clung to the windshield and the breath rose in smoky puffs, she seemed to prefer the discomfort of her vehicle to the shelter of her own home. Neighbors wondered about this habit. Some whispered that she was eccentric. Others suspected the house had serious problems with plumbing or heating. But no one could truly understand why a woman with a home just a few feet away would choose to spend her nights in such conditions. To Martha, the car had become a kind of refuge. It was small, contained, and easier to manage. She could bring the few belongings she needed into the back seat, surround herself with them like a fragile shield, and pretend for a little while that she was not surrounded by emptiness. Daytime routines painted a similar picture of quiet survival. Martha would rise early, stretch her stiff limbs after a restless night in the car, and make her way to the nearby gym. Not for exercise, but because it was the one place where she could use the restroom, wash her face, and regain some semblance of dignity. Afterward, she would stop by a fast food place, buying a small meal that would serve as both breakfast and lunch. Then she would return to her yard, carrying plastic bags of food, magazines, or sometimes small trinkets that she clutched as though they were treasures. These items never seemed to go into the house, but rather piled up inside her car or on the porch, like scattered pieces of a life she was unable to organize. Despite this strange routine, Martha remained friendly. She spoke to her neighbors with courtesy, asked after their children, and even complimented their gardens as though nothing were amiss. But behind the politeness was a woman struggling under the weight of memories and loss. She would often glance at her house with a look of both longing and fear, as if torn between the desire to go inside and the dread of what awaited her there. To the casual eye, it might have seemed that Martha was simply stubborn or quirky, but to those who watched more closely, the signs were clear. This was not a matter of choice. Something had driven her out of her home, something that kept her at bay despite the familiarity of its walls. The blinds were always drawn tight, the windows smeared with dust, and even the lawn seemed to echo her absence. On particularly windy nights, neighbors heard the creak of shutters banging loosely, and sometimes a faint rattle of broken glass from the upper windows. The house no longer looked like a shelter. It looked like a shell. Martha herself could not explain, even to those who asked kindly, why she could not sleep beneath her own roof. She would smile, shake her head, and change the subject. Yet deep down she knew the answer, and it pressed on her heart every day. The home that once symbolized safety and family had become a place of suffocation. Every corner reminded her of what she had lost. Every shadow carried the weight of her husband's absence, and the clutter that had grown over the years now stood like walls of its own, blocking her path and her will to return. She had allowed the mess to take control, allowed it to spread like ivy across the walls of her memory, and now the thought of stepping back inside filled her with dread. Still, she tried to hold on to normalcy in whatever small ways she could. She dressed neatly each morning, combed her hair, and put on a touch of lipstick, as though appearances might shield her from the truth. She waved at the mailman, exchanged polite words at the store, and carried herself with the dignity of someone who refused to be pitied. But in the quiet hours of evening, when the street grew dark and only the faint glow of her car's dome light illuminated her weary face, it was clear that dignity was all she had left. The town had grown used to her presence, and most people simply looked away. Yet a few could not help but wonder. They remembered the woman she had once been, the gatherings in her yard, the kindness she had shown to anyone in need. And they wondered how such a life could unravel so completely. To them, it was a mystery. To Martha, it was a secret she had no strength to share. As summer days stretched on and the weeds grew taller around the porch, the contrast between Martha's cheerful greetings and the decay of her surroundings became harder to ignore. The shutters flapped noisily in the wind, the grass reached up to her knees, and the roof sagged like a tired old man bowing under the weight of years. She noticed these things, but each time she looked too long at the house, her chest tightened. It was easier to turn away, to close the car door, and retreat into her fragile cocoon of blankets and memories. And so the quiet life of Martha continued, a life that looked calm on the surface, but was shaped by hidden struggles. To the world, she was a kind old woman with odd habits. To herself, she was a prisoner of her own home, exiled by grief, and by the overwhelming weight of what lay within. What no one yet realized was that the house itself carried a secret, one that would soon come to light in ways that neither Martha nor her neighbors could ever have imagined. The days drifted into one another in Martha's quiet neighborhood, and though the pace of life was gentle, people began to notice more than they once had. It was not in the nature of neighbors to pry too deeply, but when the oddities became patterns, it was difficult to ignore them altogether. Martha's habit of sleeping in her car was no longer a one-time occurrence to be excused or dismissed. It had become her way of life. Each evening, as the sun went down and the shadows lengthened across the street, her figure could be seen climbing carefully into the driver's seat, tucking a blanket around her shoulders and preparing herself for another night in the confined space of the old Buick. In the mornings, she would emerge stiff and slow, moving toward the gym or into town, her face composed but her eyes carrying the dull weight of weariness. Whispers began to spread along the sidewalks and across porches. Some of the neighbors thought perhaps Martha was having trouble with the furnace, or that the plumbing inside her house had failed, leaving her unable to stay there comfortably. Others imagined more troubling possibilities, that the structure itself was unsafe, or that she feared someone might break in if she slept indoors. Children, overhearing their parents' speculation, began to invent wilder stories, telling each other that Martha's house was haunted, or that she was hiding something so terrible inside that even she dared not step over the threshold. Most dismissed these tales as childish fancy, but the sense of unease lingered. The more observant among them realized that she was living a life that straddled the edge of survival. She carried plastic bags to and from her car, yet no one ever saw her bring groceries into the house. She often sat on the porch during the day, but she never pulled open the screen door behind her. The blinds remained tightly closed at all hours, giving the house a shuttered, secretive look, and the once bright windows were streaked with dust and grime. The grass grew wild and untended, reaching higher with each passing week until it seemed to swallow the front steps. The house, once a place of hospitality, now stood as a silent warning of neglect. One man, however, noticed more keenly than most. Thomas lived 2 houses down and had known Martha and her husband for decades. They had once shared dinners, lent tools, and swapped stories over fences. Though years had passed since those friendlier days, he still regarded her with respect and a quiet fondness. When he first saw her sleeping in her car, he told himself it was just temporary, perhaps the result of some minor household issue. But as summer gave way to autumn and her habit continued, his concern deepened. He began to keep a discreet watch, noting the times she left and returned, the way she struggled with her bags, and the exhaustion etched into her movements. Thomas could not help but remember the house as it had once been. He recalled the smell of Martha's cooking wafting through the open windows, the sight of her husband repairing the porch rail, the sound of children laughing in the yard. Now those memories clashed painfully with the image of the overgrown lawn and the sagging shutters. The home seemed abandoned, yet the woman remained, hovering at its edges, never crossing the boundary. It puzzled him, but it also stirred in him a growing sense of responsibility. Others in the neighborhood were content to speculate, offering theories from a distance, but Thomas found it difficult to simply look away. He would nod to Martha as she passed, and she would respond with her usual warm smile, yet the smile never reached her eyes. When he attempted to ask casually about the house, she brushed the question aside with gentle deflections, changing the subject to his garden or the weather. Her evasions only deepened his curiosity, for he could see that she was not merely hiding inconvenience, but guarding something heavier, something that pressed on her spirit. In time, Even those who did not speak openly began to feel the tension that seemed to hang about the property. The broken window at the top floor, left unrepaired for months, became a symbol of decay. On windy nights, the hollow sound of the shutters banging echoed across the street like a mournful call. The house was not simply falling into disrepair, it was surrendering to it. Yet, Martha remained outwardly composed, continuing her polite greetings, continuing her daily routine of leaving and returning, as though nothing were wrong. Children, who often sense what adults try to conceal, avoided the yard altogether. They hurried past on their way to school, glancing sideways at the dark windows as if expecting to see eyes staring back at them. The house carried an aura now, and the woman who lived beside it seemed caught between two worlds, one of normal human connection and another of isolation, guarded fiercely by silence. Thomas wrestled with his thoughts. He knew that stepping too far into someone else's private life could be unwelcome, even offensive. Yet he also knew that to do nothing was to abandon a neighbor who had once shown kindness to him and his family. The conflict weighed heavily on him as he sat on his porch in the evenings, watching the lights flicker on in other homes while Martha's house remained dark, except for the faint glow of her car dome light. He thought of her dignity, the way she still held herself upright despite everything, and he wondered how much longer she could endure such a life. The town itself seemed to conspire in reminding him of her decline. When he drove past the church on Sunday mornings, he remembered how she once sang in the choir, her voice steady and clear. Now she rarely attended services, and when she did, she sat quietly in the back, slipping out before anyone could ask questions. At the grocery store, he saw her purchase only the smallest of meals, never enough for a household, just enough for one day's survival. These observations, small in themselves, built into a larger picture that could no longer be ignored. It was not only Thomas who felt it. Though the whispers among the neighbors were often cloaked in curiosity rather than compassion, there were moments when a genuine worry surfaced. They asked themselves if Martha was ill, if she had fallen into poverty, if she was too proud to ask for help. Yet none of them dared to knock on her door, for the house itself had become forbidding. It seemed to repel intrusion, its walls sagging, its silence heavy. To cross that threshold felt like trespassing into something not merely private but sacred, or perhaps cursed. As weeks turned to months, the sense of unease grew. The neighborhood, once accustomed to the sight of Martha's flourishing home, now found itself unsettled by its transformation. It was not only an eyesore, it was a mystery. A woman so dignified, so long respected, had retreated into secrecy, and no one could fathom the reason. Theories multiplied, and so did the quiet sorrow that accompanied them. The house, looming in its disrepair, had become a presence of its own, and those who lived nearby could not escape its shadow. For Thomas, the matter could no longer be left to idle speculation. He felt an obligation, born of old friendship and human decency, to understand what had happened. He knew it would not be easy, that Martha guarded her silence carefully, but he also knew that sometimes silence hid suffering too deep to carry alone. Watching her move between her car and her porch, never stepping inside, he resolved that somehow he would find a way to help. And so the suspicions of the neighbors, once whispers on the wind, began to crystallize into a single question. What was it about the house that kept Martha at bay? The answer, hidden behind closed blinds and locked doors, waited in the darkness, and soon enough it would begin to reveal itself. Thomas's decision to act did not come in a single moment of impulse, but rather as the slow result of weeks of unease building inside him. He had watched long enough, he told himself, and to stand idle while Martha withered away in silence felt like a betrayal of the friendship their families once shared. He could no longer accept the image of her folding herself into the cramped space of her car night after night, her dignity intact only in outward appearance. There had to be a reason, and if she would not speak of it, then perhaps it was his responsibility to find out. The opportunity arose on a warm afternoon when he saw her struggling to carry a cluster of plastic bags from the porch toward her car. He walked over, offering to help. At first, she refused, her familiar smile masking discomfort, but the weight of the bags was too much for her aging hands, and at last, she allowed him to lift them. It was a simple gesture, but it broke the barrier she had maintained for so long. When Thomas suggested carrying the bags into the house rather than to the car, she hesitated visibly. For a long moment, she looked at the front door as though it were a threshold to another world, one she dared not cross. Her lips tightened, her breath caught, and then she shook her head quickly, insisting that the bags belonged in the car. But Thomas, gentle yet persistent, reminded her that the porch was no place to keep food, that surely her home would provide better shelter for her things. After a silence that felt longer than it was, Martha relented. She stepped aside, her frail hand brushing the doorframe as though in farewell, and allowed him to turn the handle. The moment the door creaked open, a stale odor struck him like a physical blow. It was a smell of dust, dampness, and decay all mingled together, a scent that spoke of years without care. As the door swung wider, piles of objects shifted and toppled against one another, sliding onto the porch in a miniature avalanche. Old newspapers, yellowed and brittle, spilled out along with plastic containers and tattered clothing. Thomas instinctively stepped back, his foot catching on the threshold, and for a heartbeat he wondered if he had made a mistake in pressing the matter at all. But the look on Martha's face, resigned, sorrowful, as though she had been expecting this very collapse, pushed him forward. Inside, the once familiar house bore little resemblance to the home he remembered. The hallway that had once welcomed guests with polished wood floors and framed photographs was now a tunnel carved between towers of clutter. The path was so narrow he had to press against the wall to move through, his shoulder brushing against precarious stacks that threatened to fall at any moment. Dust floated in the air, visible in the thin beam of sunlight that managed to slip through a crack in the curtains. Every surface was covered, every corner filled, as though the house itself had been swallowed by things. Thomas's eyes darted from one pile to another, trying to make sense of the chaos. In the living room, cardboard boxes were stacked nearly to the ceiling, their contents spilling through gaps. Children's toys, cracked dishes, faded magazines. A once elegant armchair was buried beneath a mountain of clothes, its fabric torn and stained. The air was heavy with the sour tang of mold, and he pulled the neck of his shirt over his nose in an instinctive attempt to filter it out. He looked back at Martha, who had followed him only as far as the doorway, her body rigid, her gaze averted as though she could not bear to witness the sight. Moving cautiously forward, he entered the kitchen where the smell intensified. The sink was filled with dishes long abandoned, coated with hardened food and blackened residue. Countertops were lost beneath layers of old jars, empty cartons, and wilted papers. The refrigerator hummed faintly but reeked of rot when he passed by it. On the floor, scraps of food packaging mingled with broken glass, and a trail of ants led into the shadows beneath the stove. It was a place that had not known cleanliness in years, a place where the ordinary rhythm of cooking and gathering had been replaced by silent neglect. Thomas's heart ached as he took it all in. He remembered sitting at Martha's table once, laughing with her husband, sharing a meal in a room filled with warmth. To see it now, overtaken by filth and silence, was almost unbearable. He realized that this was why she had chosen the car. The house, for all its walls and roof, had ceased to be a home. It was a labyrinth of objects and memories, suffocating rather than sheltering. Yet, amid the clutter, something caught his attention. At the top of the stairs, just visible through the dim light, was a door that looked somehow different from the others. Where the rest of the house was buried in debris, this door stood closed, its frame surprisingly free of the chaos spilling around it. There were no boxes leaning against it, no clothing heaped at its base. It was as if the clutter itself respected its boundary. The brass handle was tarnished but intact, and the wood, though dusty, bore no sign of rot. Thomas felt a strange pull toward it. Something in the way Martha stiffened when his eyes lingered on that door told him it was important, perhaps the key to everything he could not understand. He turned toward her, and though she had not followed him up the stairs, her voice drifted upward, sharp and unyielding. "Not that one." The command froze him in place. The tone was unlike the gentle, evasive words she usually spoke. It was a plea wrapped in steel, a desperate insistence that he obey. For a long moment he stood there, torn between respect for her boundaries and the gnawing sense that the answer lay just beyond that door. The house had revealed its neglect, its suffocating weight of things, but this door hinted at something else entirely, something preserved or hidden. He imagined what might be behind it. Perhaps a room left untouched, perhaps something that explained her retreat from her own home. The urge to open it was strong, but the sight of Martha at the bottom of the stairs, her eyes downcast, her hands clenched together, stopped him. She looked smaller than ever, diminished by grief and fear. He descended slowly, setting the bags he had carried on the cluttered porch, and stepped back outside. The fresh air struck him like a wave, clearing the staleness from his lungs. Martha followed, closing the door behind her as though sealing away a secret that could not be spoken. Neither of them addressed what had just happened. Instead, she offered him that same weary smile, the one that tried to pretend nothing was amiss. But Thomas knew better now. He had glimpsed the truth. The house was not simply neglected, it was uninhabitable. And that closed door upstairs, whatever it concealed, was at the heart of it. As he walked back to his own house, his mind churned. The whispers of the neighbors seemed trivial compared to the reality he had witnessed. He had entered a place not of ordinary disrepair, but of despair solidified into walls of clutter. Martha's refusal to cross the threshold was no longer a mystery. It was survival. Yet the image of that solitary door lingered, a question unanswered, a secret pressing against the edges of his thoughts. That night, as the street grew dark and Martha settled once more into her car, Thomas sat on his porch, watching the faint glow of her dome light flicker on. He thought of the air inside her house, heavy with mold, the piles that shifted with each step, and above it all, the closed door that seemed to guard more than just a room. He understood now that her silence was not simple pride or eccentricity. It was protection, perhaps from grief, perhaps from memory, perhaps from something she could not bring herself to face. The neighbors still speculated, their conversations buzzing with theories. But Thomas no longer cared for their idle talk. He knew the truth was far heavier, and though he did not yet know how, he resolved that he would help Martha confront it. For the secret behind that door could not remain hidden forever, and when it finally came to light, it would explain everything. The days after Thomas's first step inside Martha's house were restless ones for him. He could not shake the images from his mind. The narrow pathways carved through mountains of possessions, the suffocating smell of mold, the dim light straining to pierce through curtains drawn tight for years. Most of all, it was that closed door at the top of the stairs that haunted him, standing untouched in a house otherwise consumed by chaos. He replayed the firmness in Martha's voice when she forbade him from approaching it, and he recognized in her tone something deeper than mere embarrassment. That door was not a barrier of wood and brass alone. It was a barrier of memory, grief, and a kind of devotion that bordered on fear. Thomas tried to resume his normal routine, trimming his hedges, walking to the corner store, exchanging pleasantries with other neighbors. Yet, every time he saw Martha move slowly between her car and the porch, her arms full of bags she never carried inside, he felt the pull of responsibility. He had glimpsed too much to pretend ignorance. Behind her polite words and her deliberate avoidance of questions, there was a woman drowning in sorrow. He sensed that her survival, thin as it was, depended on keeping that door closed. But he also sensed that one day soon it would have to be opened. It was late one afternoon when Martha, perhaps tired of his persistence or simply weary of her own silence, invited him once more toward the house. She did not say why. She only gestured with a kind of resignation, as if knowing that the weight of her secret was too heavy to carry alone any longer. This time, when the front door creaked open, Thomas prepared himself. He pulled a scarf over his nose against the stench and stepped carefully through the narrow path carved by neglect. Martha followed him slowly, her gaze fixed downward, each step reluctant. The climb up the staircase was like ascending into another world. Dust clung to the banister, the steps creaked ominously, and the air grew heavier with every foot. When they reached the top, Thomas paused before the closed door. He felt Martha's presence just behind him, her breath shallow and uneven. He turned slightly, waiting for her permission, but she said nothing. Instead, her trembling hand lifted toward the handle. She did not grip it, but her fingers hovered close, her eyes wet with unspoken pain. Finally, in a voice that was barely more than a whisper, she said, "He lived here. This room, it's all I have left of him." Thomas understood. Her husband's memory lingered not only in her heart, but in the very fabric of that room. For her, to open the door was to break the fragile seal of a sanctuary where time had not moved forward. Gently, he asked if she wished to continue, and after a long silence she gave the smallest of nods. Her hand fell back to her side, and she allowed him to open it. The hinges groaned as the door swung inward, and immediately the air shifted. Unlike the rest of the house, where the stench of rot and mold dominated, here there was a faint, lingering scent of old wood and fabric preserved in stillness. The room had been spared the invasion of clutter. Everything inside remained in its place, as though waiting for the man who had once lived there to return at any moment. The bed was neatly made, and its quilt tucked tight, though the colors had faded. A jacket hung on the back of a chair, sleeves gently folded as if its owner had only just taken it off. On the desk sat a pair of glasses, a pen, and a stack of papers yellowed with time. Photographs lined the walls, smiling faces of children, wedding portraits, snapshots of family barbecues and church gatherings. Thomas stepped cautiously inside. his chest heavy with reverence. He felt as though he had entered not just a room, but a shrine. Everything spoke of the man who had once been the center of Martha's life, a man whose absence had left the house hollow and his wife adrift. He could almost hear echoes of his laughter, see him bent over the desk writing letters, imagine him settling into the chair after a long day's work. The room pulsed with memory, untouched by the decay that had overtaken the rest of the home. Martha lingered in the doorway, her body taut with conflicting emotions. Her eyes scanned the room, drinking in every detail, but she did not step across the threshold. "I couldn't change it," she admitted softly, "not after he was gone. Every time I tried, it felt like I was erasing him. So I closed the door. I thought if I left it as it was, I could keep him here." Her voice trembled, and she pressed a hand against the frame to steady herself. Thomas listened, his heart aching at the rawness of her confession. He understood now why she had let the rest of the house collapse around her. The clutter, the piles of possessions, the endless hoarding. It was her way of filling the silence left behind. She could not bring herself to part with anything, because parting with objects felt like parting with memory. The weight of grief had pressed her down, and rather than confront it, she had built walls of things to shield herself from the emptiness. But the room of memory, as Thomas now thought of it, was different. Here she had resisted the chaos, keeping everything as it had been, protecting the last fragments of her life with her husband. It was both her sanctuary and her prison. For years she had lived at its threshold, unable to enter and unwilling to let go. Yet, even in this preserved place, there were signs of danger. Along the far corner, the paint on the ceiling had darkened, and faint streaks of black mold spread outward like veins. The wallpaper near the window peeled under the pressure of humidity, and the glass panes were clouded with condensation that never seemed to lift. The air, though cleaner than the rest of the house, carried a dampness that hinted at slow decay creeping inward. It was clear that even this sacred space could not remain untouched forever. Martha saw it too. Her eyes fixed on the spreading stains, and her face crumpled with despair. She knew what it meant. Time was eroding even the one place she had tried to protect. With every storm, every drop of rain that seeped through the roof, the room lost a little more of its purity. "It's slipping away from me," she whispered, tears streaking her cheeks. "Even here, I can't hold on." Thomas stepped closer, gently laying a hand on her arm. He told her she was not alone, that clinging to the past did not honor it, but chained her to sorrow. He did not speak these words to scold or correct, but to remind her that her memories of her husband lived in her, not only in these fading relics. Yet as he looked around the room, he knew that no gentle persuasion could undo years of grief in a moment. For Martha, letting go would require more than words. It would require facing the truth that her home itself had become a danger. The visit ended quietly. Martha closed the door once more, though not with the sharp finality she had before. This time it was with a kind of weary acceptance, as if acknowledging that the room could not remain untouched forever. They descended the stairs in silence, the clutter pressing close around them, the air heavy once more with mold and dust. When they emerged into the daylight, both breathed deeply, grateful for the clean air, yet both carried the weight of what had been revealed. For Thomas, the mystery was no longer a puzzle of odd habits or eccentric choices. It was the story of a woman who had lost the center of her life and had tried, in vain, to keep it alive within four walls. The room upstairs was the key to everything. Her retreat to the car, her refusal to open her home, her silence when others asked. It was love preserved in dust, grief preserved in stillness. And it was also the warning sign of a danger that could no longer be ignored. That evening, as Martha once again settled into her car for the night, Thomas sat awake long after darkness fell, troubled by what he had seen. The room of memory was beautiful in its devotion, but it was also slowly being consumed by the same forces that had overtaken the rest of the house. Something had to be done, and he knew that the time was drawing near when Martha's secret would no longer be hers alone to bear. The discovery of the preserved room weighed heavily on Thomas in the days that followed. Every time he passed by Martha's driveway and saw her resting uncomfortably in the worn seat of her car, he thought of that upstairs space where time had stood still, surrounded by walls that were slowly darkening with mold. He knew she could not remain as she was, clinging to a life that was crumbling around her, yet he also knew that she did not have the strength to change things on her own. The room, filled with photographs and relics of her husband, had been her sanctuary for years, but now it was being invaded by the same rot that had overtaken the rest of the house. The memory she had tried to protect was dissolving before her eyes, and with it went the fragile balance she had built to survive. Thomas wrestled with what to do. He wanted to help without intruding too deeply into her grief, yet he could not stand by and watch her slowly vanish into despair. Finally, after much thought, he decided that she needed more than quiet companionship. She needed professional help. The house was beyond anything an ordinary neighbor could manage. It required people who understood the dangers of mold and decay, people who could look past the surface and see the risks to her health and even her life. Approaching Martha with the idea was not easy. When he first mentioned bringing in specialists to evaluate the house, her face hardened with fear. She shook her head, her lips trembling, and whispered that she could not bear to see strangers rummaging through her things. It was not just the clutter she feared losing. It was the pieces of her husband's presence scattered through every pile. For her, each object, no matter how small or useless, carried weight. To have them taken away would feel like another death. But Thomas persisted gently, reminding her that she was already living outside her home, that her health was suffering, and that the house itself might be poisoning her. He spoke not as a neighbor intruding, but as a friend who remembered the woman she had once been and longed to see her safe. Slowly, with great reluctance, Martha agreed. She did not promise cooperation, but she nodded when he offered to arrange for inspectors to come. It was the first step, and Thomas clung to it as a fragile victory. When the specialists arrived, the transformation of the neighborhood was immediate. A pair of white vans parked outside Martha's property drew the attention of every passerby. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains, whispering about what might be happening. Some hoped the house could be repaired, while others speculated that it was beyond saving. Martha herself stood on the porch, her arms wrapped tightly around her thin frame, her eyes fixed on the ground as the inspectors donned protective masks and gloves before entering. Inside, the professionals moved with practiced efficiency. They carried flashlights and instruments, probing the walls, testing the air, and taking samples from the dark streaks that spread across the ceilings. Their voices were low but serious, their expressions grim. Thomas accompanied them, standing back as they examined room after room. He felt again the suffocating closeness of the piles, the oppressive stench of rot, and he watched as the inspectors exchanged glances that told him what he already suspected. The house was far worse than it appeared from the outside. When they reached the upstairs room, Thomas hesitated, unsure whether to reveal it. But Martha, perhaps understanding that the time for secrecy was past, stepped forward herself. With trembling hands, she opened the door and allowed them inside. The specialists moved carefully, respectful of the space that clearly meant so much to her. They examined the ceiling, the spreading mold, the dampness that seeped through the walls. One of them sighed heavily and shook his head. It was not just a patch of mildew. It was a colony that had been growing unchecked for years, releasing spores into the air, eating into the structure itself. By the time the inspection was finished, the verdict was clear. The lead inspector gathered Martha and Thomas in the yard, where the air was mercifully free of toxins, and spoke with quiet finality. The house was uninhabitable. The mold had penetrated the wood, the walls, even the foundation. To attempt a repair would be to invite disaster. The cost of stripping it clean would exceed the value of the house itself, and even then, there was no guarantee it could be made safe. There was only one option. The house had to be demolished. The words struck Martha like a blow. She swayed where she stood, clutching the porch rail for balance. For years, she had lived in limbo, neither inside her home nor fully outside it, but now the fragile sanctuary was being stripped away altogether. The inspectors explained that due to the scale of contamination, the demolition could not be handled like an ordinary teardown. The safest method would be to burn the structure in a controlled fire, supervised by the fire department, ensuring that the mold spores and rot would not spread further. It was a drastic measure, rare and final, but it was the only way. Tears welled in Martha's eyes as she listened. The thought of watching her house consumed by flames was almost unbearable. Every corner of it held memories. The living room where her children had played, the kitchen where her husband had sat drinking coffee, the porch where she had waved at neighbors passing by. To lose it all in one fiery instant felt like erasing her entire life. Yet, she also knew that the house was already lost to her. She had not truly lived there for years, and the room she cherished was crumbling from within. What she clung to was no longer safety, but sorrow. Thomas reached for her hand as the inspectors finished their explanation. He could feel the tremor running through her, the fragile strength she tried to muster. He knew that in this moment, his role was not to offer solutions, but to stand beside her, to remind her that she was not facing the loss alone. She drew a shaky breath and nodded slowly, her voice hoarse as she whispered her consent. If the house had to be destroyed, then so be it. Better to end the suffering than to prolong it. Word of the impending demolition spread quickly through the neighborhood. Some expressed relief, believing the house had been a danger for too long. Others grieved for the woman who had lived there, imagining what it must be like to watch the walls of one's past turn to ash. Martha herself moved through the days that followed in a daze, her steps heavy, her voice faint. She gathered a few small items, an old photo album, her husband's wedding ring, a Bible worn from use, placing them in a box that she kept close. Everything else she left untouched. It was too painful to choose, and in truth, there was little that could be saved without risk of contamination. On the evening before the fire was scheduled, Martha sat in her car, as she had so many nights before. But this time, she was not avoiding the house. She was saying goodbye. The dark windows stared back at her like empty eyes, the broken shutters flapping in the wind. She thought of the years she had spent within those walls, of the laughter and the arguments, of birthdays and Christmas mornings. She thought of her husband, his voice echoing faintly in memory, his presence still lingering in the upstairs room. And she thought of how tomorrow, All of it would be gone. Thomas visited her one last time that night, bringing her a warm meal and sitting beside her in silence. They did not speak much. Words felt hollow against the weight of what awaited them. Instead, they watched the house together, its silhouette looming against the fading sky, and each in their own way prepared for the fire that would come with the dawn. The morning came heavy with silence, the kind of silence that precedes something irreversible. Martha had slept little, if at all. She had sat in her car for hours, staring at the dark outline of her house as if by watching closely enough she could hold it together for one more night. But dawn arrived regardless, spilling its pale light across the sagging roof, the cracked windows, and the broken shutters. With the rising sun came the first signs of movement on the street. The fire trucks arrived slowly, followed by vans carrying officials and volunteers, their presence a somber reminder that today would end differently from any other. The neighbors emerged too, gathering at the edges of their yards, some clutching cups of coffee, others simply folding their arms and watching in uneasy silence. Curiosity mingled with sympathy, and though not all had shown kindness to Martha during her long struggle, on this morning they felt the weight of her loss. To see a house burn was dramatic enough, but to see a life's worth of memories reduced to ash carried a sorrow that no one could easily dismiss. Children clung to their parents' sides, whispering questions about why such a thing had to be done, and the adults hushed them gently, offering no clear answer. Martha herself remained on her porch, sitting in a weathered chair with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. In her lap, she cradled the small box she had packed the night before, the photo album, the wedding ring, the Bible, and a few other objects she could not bear to leave behind. She looked frail against the backdrop of her collapsing home, her eyes red but dry, as though her tears had been spent long before the morning came. The box seemed to anchor her, a fragile raft against the tide of memory threatening to sweep her away. The firefighters moved with quiet precision, preparing the house for its final moment. They secured the area, marked boundaries, and checked the winds to ensure the flames would not spread. Each action was deliberate, practiced, but respectful, for they knew that what they were about to do was not merely technical, it was personal. One of them approached Martha, removing his helmet as he crouched beside her, explaining the procedure with a gentle tone. She nodded faintly, her fingers tightening around the box. She did not ask questions, for the answers mattered little. She already understood the outcome. Thomas arrived shortly after, walking briskly down the street, his face solemn. He joined Martha on the porch, sitting beside her without a word. His presence was steady, and though he did not attempt to comfort her with empty phrases, his being there was comfort enough. Together they watched as the preparations neared completion, their silence filled with the weight of years shared and losses endured. The crowd swelled as more townsfolk gathered. Some brought chairs, others stood at the curb, all drawn by the gravity of the moment. There was a strange sense of ritual about it, as if the destruction of Martha's house was not just her burden, but an event for the entire community. The structure had stood for decades, its presence woven into the fabric of the neighborhood, and now its end would be witnessed by many eyes. Conversations buzzed quietly, speculations about what had been found inside, about how Martha would manage afterward. Yet beneath the curiosity lay an undercurrent of respect, for they could see that this was not gossip but grief. When the signal was given, the firefighters moved into place. A hush fell over the gathering as the first flames were set. At first, it was only a faint crackle, a tongue of fire licking at the dry wood of the porch steps, but quickly the heat spread, climbing upward, devouring paint and splintered boards. Within minutes, smoke billowed thick and dark into the sky, curling above the rooftops. The flames roared louder, seizing the walls, leaping through broken windows. The house that had once held laughter and life was now a furnace of collapsing timbers and falling plaster. Martha flinched when the first loud crack echoed, the sound of a beam giving way. She clutched her box tighter, her knuckles pale against the wood. Her lips trembled, but still no tears came. It was as though the sight of the fire had moved her beyond weeping into a realm of stunned acceptance. Thomas placed a hand over hers, grounding her as the inferno consumed the structure piece by piece. She leaned slightly toward him, not in weakness, but in acknowledgement that she did not stand alone in her farewell. The crowd shifted uneasily, some turning away from the side, others staring with morbid fascination. Children gasped as the flames shot higher, sparks dancing in the wind, while older residents bowed their heads in quiet prayer. The fire's heat radiated outward, forcing the spectators to take a step back, but Martha remained in her chair resolute. She did not move until the flames reached the roof, until the shingles burst into cinders and the last semblance of her home's form began to collapse inward. Only then did she whisper, so faintly that only Thomas heard, "It's over." The firefighters maintained their vigilance, directing the flames, ensuring that the blaze remained contained. They knew the danger of stray embers and shifting winds, and they worked tirelessly even as the house gave way. Hours seemed to pass, though in truth it was far less, until finally the fire began to weaken. The roaring gave way to the steady hiss of smoldering wood, the blackened skeleton of the house sagging into ash. Water hoses sprayed the remaining hot spots, steam rising like ghosts into the morning air. When it was finished, when nothing remained but charred beams and gray smoke, Martha closed her eyes. For years she had lived under the shadow of those walls, unable to enter, yet unable to let go. Now the house was gone, reduced to earth and air, and with its destruction came a strange lightness she had not expected. She felt hollow, yes, but also unburdened, as though the fire had burned away not only the wood and stone, but the chains of her grief. The memories of her husband still lived within her, intact and untouchable, but the physical prison she had built around them was gone. The crowd began to disperse, their murmurs fading as they returned to their lives. The firefighters remained, standing watch until the last embers cooled. Thomas stayed with Martha, helping her to her feet, steadying her as she clutched the box against her chest. She turned once more to the ruins, her gaze lingering on the smoke that curled upward into the sky. "That was our life," she murmured, not in bitterness, but in recognition. Then, after a pause, she added, "And now it's time for another." Together they walked away from the smoldering remains, the box secure in her arms. The air was thick with ash, but in the distance the sky cleared, streaked with the pale blue of afternoon. For the first time in years, Martha stepped forward without glancing back at her house, because there was no house left to hold her. She carried her memories, her grief, and her hope into the unknown, ready at last to face whatever came next. The ruins of Martha's house smoldered for hours after the flames had subsided, leaving behind little more than a blackened foundation and drifting smoke. The ground was littered with ash and splintered beams, the air still tinged with the acrid smell of burning. Neighbors had gathered in the morning to witness the destruction, but by afternoon most had retreated to their own lives, leaving the street quiet once more. Only a handful of people remained, moving carefully among the debris, ensuring that no embers reignited. Martha stood a short distance away, her frail figure silhouetted against the haze, the box of her most precious belongings still clutched tightly to her chest. For the first time in years, she looked at the space where her house had stood and felt neither the heavy dread of entering nor the suffocating pressure of memory pressing in on her. There was nothing left to fear. The walls were gone, the rooms erased, the locked door that had guarded her sorrow reduced to ash. What remained was absence, but it was an absence that carried with it a strange and unexpected relief. Thomas stayed by her side, offering a steadying arm as the firefighters completed their final checks. She seemed smaller than ever in the waning light. Her shoulders stooped, her breath unsteady, but her eyes no longer avoided the sight of her property. Instead, she studied the ruins as though searching for the shape of her past within them, and finding only shadows, allowed them to fade. She whispered her thanks to each of the men and women who approached her, gratitude mingled with sorrow, and though her voice cracked, it carried strength. To everyone's surprise, she did not weep. Her tears had been spent in the long years leading to this moment. What filled her now was not despair, but a quiet readiness to move forward. In the days that followed, the neighborhood shifted in subtle ways. People who had once kept their distance came forward to offer help. Meals were delivered, errands were run, and donations were gathered discreetly. Martha, who had been living in her car, now accepted the kindness of those around her without the hesitation she once showed. She understood that she could not begin again alone, and the compassion of her neighbors became a bridge between the life she had lost and the one she had yet to discover. Thomas visited her daily, not to pry but to stand beside her as a friend, and together they discussed what came next. It was clear that Martha could not rebuild on the property. The ground itself was unsafe, the costs too high, and the memories too heavy. Instead, the community rallied to find her a place where she could live safely and with dignity. A small apartment in a senior living community was offered, its rent subsidized by local programs and the generosity of those who knew her story. At first, she hesitated, uncertain if she could adapt to a new environment after so many years tied to one place. But when Thomas drove her to visit, she was greeted by warm faces, tidy rooms, and the inviting scent of fresh flowers in the lobby. There were other residents her age, some reading in armchairs, others chatting on shaded patios, and she felt a stirring of something she had not known for years: belonging. Moving was not easy. Even with so little left to take, each object carried weight. The photo album was packed carefully, along with her husband's ring and the Bible that had rested on her nightstand for decades. A few clothes, a framed picture of her wedding day, and a quilt her mother had sewn long ago completed the collection. When Thomas carried the box into her new apartment, Martha stood in the doorway for a long time, her hand resting on the frame, uncertain whether to step inside. But then she crossed the threshold, and the brightness of the room greeted her. The walls were plain, but they were clean. The windows let in sunlight without dust or grime to block it. She set her belongings gently on a small table and sat down, breathing in the freshness of a new beginning. Her life slowly began to change. Without the burden of her collapsing house, she no longer needed to retreat into her car each night. She slept in a bed again, beneath clean sheets, and though sleep did not come easily at first, the absence of mold and shadows lifted the suffocating weight from her chest. She started to eat proper meals prepared in the community dining hall, and her body, once weakened by fast food and neglect, began to regain strength. She joined small activities, morning walks, a knitting circle, even a music hour where residents sang hymns together. At first, she sat quietly at the edges, but in time she found herself humming along, her voice tentative yet clear. Thomas remained a steady presence in her life, visiting often, sharing stories of the neighborhood, and assuring her that she was not forgotten. He reminded her that the house had been a place, not the essence of her memories, and that her husband's legacy lived on in her heart, not in crumbling walls. Slowly, she began to believe it. On quiet evenings, she would sit by the window of her new apartment, the photo album open on her lap, and instead of tears, she felt warmth. The images no longer bound her to sorrow, but reminded her of love that had shaped her life. The community embraced her, too. Where once her house had been a source of whispered gossip, now her resilience inspired admiration. People spoke of her courage in letting go, of her strength in facing loss. Children who once hurried past her yard now waved to her when she visited the park, and their parents greeted her with kindness. She was no longer the reclusive woman in the car, but part of a circle of care that had widened to welcome her. In time, Martha began to let go of her hoarding habit. Surrounded by simplicity, she discovered peace in having only what she truly needed. The clutter that had once filled her home had been a shield against loneliness, but now she found comfort in conversation, in laughter, in the gentle rhythm of shared meals and daily greetings. Her husband's absence still ached, but the ache softened in the presence of companionship. She realized that by clinging to things she had tried to preserve him, but by opening her life to others, she honored him more fully. Months passed, and Martha's face grew brighter. She walked with steadier steps, spoke with clearer voice, and carried herself with dignity restored. On anniversaries and holidays, she placed her husband's ring beside her bed, whispered a prayer of gratitude, and then joined her neighbors in celebration. She discovered that grief did not end, but it could change shape, becoming part of her without ruling her. And with that realization came freedom. The lot where her house had once stood remained empty, a patch of earth marked by memories. Sometimes Thomas drove her past it, and though she looked, she no longer turned away in pain. "That was my past," she said once, her voice calm, "but my future is here." And she pointed to her chest, then to the world around her where people smiled and welcomed her, where life continued to unfold. In her twilight years, Martha found something she had not expected to know again: peace. The fire that had destroyed her house had also burned away the prison of grief and clutter that had bound her. What remained was not ash, but possibility. She carried her memories with her, not in rooms filled with objects, but in her heart, where they could not be consumed by mold or time. And though she walked into her new life with the weight of loss still upon her, she walked with her head high, her steps sure, and her spirit lightened. For the first time in many years, Martha no longer lived at the edge of sorrow. She lived within the embrace of a community, within the rhythm of days that held promise, and within herself, renewed by the knowledge that love endures even when walls fall and houses burn. She had been freed by fire, and in that freedom she discovered life once more. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell so you never miss our next shocking stories. Up next, we've got even more unbelievable twists waiting for you. Click on one of these videos on your screen right now. And if this story moved you, share it with your friends and family. Let them experience it too.